Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
And today, we are unpacking a really extensive and honestly just fascinating stack of transcripts from the White House's Religious Liberty Commission hearings.
Yeah, it's a lot of material.
It is. But these transcripts, they offer this truly comprehensive look at the modern friction points of religious freedom in America. We're looking at lived experiences, legal battles, stretching from elite college campuses and military barracks all the way to community rehab centers and local courthouses.
It's basically a massive cross-section of American life.
Exactly.
But before we really jump into it, we don't need to issue a crucial impartiality disclaimer. The source material we're looking at today contains some highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
Right. And viewpoints from both the left and the right. So we want to be abundantly clear here. Neither of us is taking a side. We are not endorsing any political figures mentioned in these hearings.
Nor are we validating the theological or political claims made by any of the witnesses.
Right. Our goal today is purely to impartially unpack and convey the arguments and the lived experiences exactly as they were presented in the transcripts.
We are simply acting as your guides to the text. We want to highlight the underlying tensions and legal philosophies that are currently shaping the public square, regardless of where you might personally fall on the political spectrum.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're starting with what the witnesses described as the college campus battlefield. Specifically, the intense clash over anti-Semitism, institutional neutrality, and civil rights at elite universities following the events of October 7th.
Yeah, and the testimony of Yitzi Frankel really stands out in this stack.
Oh, absolutely.
He's a recent law graduate from UCLA, an Orthodox Jew, and he testified about the creation of what he called Jew exclusion zones during the campus protests.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. Frankel described these masked enforcers setting up checkpoints and barricades on Rose Quad, which, if you know UCLA, is essentially the heart of the campus.
Right.
And according to his testimony, Jewish students were physically blocked from crossing their own campus unless they specifically disavowed Israel's right to exist. And they had to hide their religious symbols, like the Star of David or a kippah.
And he brought a physical prop to the hearing, right, which apparently made the whole room just stop.
Yeah, he did.
He brought his grandfather's Nazi-issued work permit, complete with a swastika.
Wow.
Yeah. His grandfather, Solomon Frankel, had to use a non-Jewish name, Ivan Bandrowski, and carry this specific ID just to pass safely and survive the Holocaust.
And the parallel he drew there is striking.
Right. Yitzi pointed out the tragic irony that 80 years later he felt forced to hide his kippah and wear an activist-approved wristband just to access public spaces at a modern American university.
And that lived experience, it translated into a major legal battle. Frankel, alongside other students and a professor, they sued UCLA.
They didn't just back down.
No, they argued that the university didn't just stand by passively, but actively aided the exclusion by instructing campus police to stand down, and even by providing the metal barricades used by the protesters.
Which is a huge claim.
It is. And the legal fallout resulted in a federal court injunction against UCLA. The university ultimately had to settle.
Yeah, I was looking at the settlement details in the transcript. They had to pay out $6.13 million.
Which is a very specific number.
It is. That's what I thought. Why not just an even $6 million?
Well, that wasn't an accounting anomaly. It was a highly deliberate message. The plaintiff specifically requested the number $6.13 million to represent the 613 commandments in the Torah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a calculated legal signal that the very faith they were asked to hide was the foundation of their victory. And the settlement also included a strict federal court order barring the exclusion of Jewish students and faculty moving forward.
That's fascinating. We also have the transcript from Shebos Kestenbaum, who testified about his experience at Harvard University.
Right, Herb.
He pointed out that the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE, recently ranked Harvard dead last for free speech.
Dead last.
Literally 248th out of 248 schools.
Ouch.
Yeah. And he painted a picture of extreme institutional hypocrisy. He argued that the university rigorously enforces codes against things like fat phobia or ableism, but completely dropped the ball when it came to protecting Jewish students from targeted harassment.
Kestenbaum shared several alarming anecdotes to back up that claim of a double standard. The most shocking one involved a student who was caught on video physically assaulting an Israeli student at the Harvard Business School.
This is the fellowship story, right?
Yes. According to Kestemom's testimony, one of the assailants in that attack was later awarded a $65,000 fellowship by Harvard Law to intern at a highly controversial organization.
Unbelievable.
And another assailant was allegedly given the honor of being a class marshal at graduation.
He also described being followed to class by masked individuals who recorded him, other visibly Jewish students. And he claimed the university disciplined absolutely no one for those actions.
Right.
So, looking at the transcripts, how did these witnesses propose actually fixing this?
Yeah.
Are they just asking for better campus guidelines?
What's fascinating here is the proposed solution that emerges from these testimonies, because they aren't just asking for apologies or revised student handbooks, they are targeting the university's wallet.
The funding.
Exactly. They want to weaponize Title VI. That's the federal civil rights law that prevents discrimination in programs receiving federal funding. Kestenbaum argued they want to explicitly tie federal funding and taxpayer dollars to civil rights enforcement.
So hit them where it hurts.
Right. If an institution fails to protect the civil rights of a religious group on campus, they lose their American taxpayer money.
Now, Rabbi Ari Berman, he's the president of Yeshiva University, he offered a much deeper philosophical diagnosis during his testimony.
He took a very different angle.
He did. He argued that the anti-Semitism we're seeing isn't actually the root disease. He sees it as a symptom of what he calls cultural amnesia and moral relativism at these elite institutions.
Rabbi Berman testified that universities have completely abandoned their historical role in shaping civic conscience and teaching objective truths about right and wrong.
And what's the result of that?
Well, he noted that this moral vacuum has led to a massive, under-discussed shift in the higher education landscape. We are seeing a tremendous surge in enrollment at faith-based colleges.
Wait, so people are actually leaving the Ivy League for religious schools?
Yes. Yeshiva University, for example, has recently doubled in size. He argued that students are actually hungry for an education that connects intellect to meaning. They want academic progress paired with moral purpose.
And they're seeking out institutions that still claim to offer an objective moral framework.
Exactly. It's a profound shift in how we think about the purpose of higher education.
Moving from the ivory tower to the streets, the transcripts take us deep into the world of social services and what the witnesses call the faith factor.
This brings us to the testimony of Professor Barbara Elliott.
Right. She spent years embedded in and documenting the work of faith-based charities.
And she presented a compelling argument that the most effective social services are fundamentally based on face-to-face, one-on-one relationships rooted in faith.
She shared a deeply vivid anecdote about a couple named Freddie and Nympha Garcia down in San Antonio.
Freddie was a former heroin addict.
Yeah. He famously hit rock bottom trying to shoot up on the floor of a dirty men's room while his baby boy lay next to him.
Just heartbreaking.
But after getting clean through a faith-based program, Freddie and Nympha opened their own home to addicts. Professor Elliott described how Nympha always had this massive pot of beans bubbling on the stove.
Just ready for anyone who walked in.
Exactly. They would take in guys completely strung out on meth or heroin, sit up with them through the night, literally hold basins for them while they were sick through withdrawal, and just love them through the transition.
And Freddie testified to the commission that you can take drugs away from a junkie and just have a reformed junkie, but if you give them faith, you have a totally transformed man.
Such a powerful distinction. Professor Elliott also highlighted a prison ministry in Houston that focused on job readiness.
The story about Michael.
Yes, Michael. A repeatedly incarcerated man who had lived on the streets under bridges his whole life. But a man from a local church ministry just kept showing up.
He wouldn't give up on him.
Right. He brought Michael food, prayed with him, and simply refused to leave him alone. And at his graduation from the program, Michael stood up and said, "I have lived like an animal my entire life, but I found my dignity this Thursday because you loved me."
The impact is just undeniable. But she also pointed out a massive bureaucratic hurdle.
The funding issue again.
Right. When these faith-based organizations seek government funding to expand their work and reach more people, they hit a brick wall. The government often requires them to completely strip away the religious elements of their programs to qualify for the money.
Which is wild. Professor Elliott talked to nuns in New York who were legally forbidden from praying with the homeless people they were serving if they wanted to maintain their state funding.
And from the perspective of these organizations, this demand is entirely counterproductive. They argue that silencing the faith factor removes the exact ingredient that makes their recovery program successful in the first place.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the witnesses dove into the historical context of this tension. For decades, the phrase wall of separation between church and state has been used in courtrooms to justify pushing faith out of the public square.
Keeping federal funding strictly secular.
Right. But Professor Elliott argued that when Thomas Jefferson originally wrote about that wall in his letter to the Danbury Baptists, his intent was to protect the church from the heavy hand of the state, not to banish religious expression or faith-based charity from public life.
And that historical reinterpretation is actively shaping current federal policy. Attorney General Pam Bondi testified about a major shift currently happening at the Department of Justice.
What's changing?
She stated that the DOJ is dropping cases against pro-life advocates who peacefully pray near clinics and is actively working to protect the rights of faith-based organizations to operate and receive funding without having to compromise their core religious beliefs.
So it's a deliberate administrative move to treat faith not as an obstacle, but as a protected public good.
Exactly.
Now, it's one thing to fight for your rights on a liberal arts campus or within a local charity. But how does this play out in an environment where obedience isn't just expected, it is quite literally a matter of life and death?
You're talking about the military transcripts.
Let's look at them. They explore the logistical and bureaucratic struggle of maintaining religious liberty within the rigid structure of the U.S. Armed Forces.
The testimony of Second Lieutenant Harris Ralph is a perfect example of how administrative rigidity can clash with sincere religious belief.
He's the Hindu soldier.
Yes. During basic training, he was told he would be deported back to India simply for wearing his religious markings. The tilak, which is a U-shaped mark on the forehead, and the chelo, a red dot.
And these aren't just cultural accessories. For him, they represent devotion and purity.
And his dietary requirements were just as strict. He follows a pure vegetarian diet. No meat, no eggs. But the transcript shows it goes deeper than that. He must avoid what are called tamasic foods in Hindu philosophy.
Which surprisingly includes things like onions and garlic.
Right. The underlying belief is that tamasic foods promote anger, agitation, and spiritual dullness.
And for a soldier who relies on absolute mental clarity and emotional control in high-stress situations, avoiding these foods is a deeply held religious practice. It's not just a personal culinary preference.
No, not at all. But he testified that he was pulled from training and placed with non-trainees. His military career was almost over before it started, until a single military chaplain intervened.
Chaplains have so much power in that ecosystem.
The immense bureaucratic power they hold cannot be overstated. They are the gatekeepers for religious accommodations. This particular chaplain asked Ralph two simple questions. First, does your religious practice affect your training? Ralph said no.
And the second?
If permitted to practice your faith, do you still want to serve? Ralph said yes, absolutely.
And that was it.
That was it. That chaplain advocated for him, navigated the military bureaucracy to get him a religious accommodation memo, and essentially saved his career. Ralph actually went on to become a commissioned officer and is now pursuing the chaplain corps himself.
That's a great outcome. But the logistical struggles go far beyond individual uniform accommodations. Rabbi Dressen testified about systemic failures in providing kosher MREs meals ready to eat to deployed Jewish soldiers.
Right. He argued that pre-deployment requests for kosher food are routinely ignored by command,
leaving observant soldiers to survive on crackers, chips, and honey buns in the field for months.
And it leads to some profound logistical failures. The rabbi shared an anecdote from the beginning of the Iraq War, where American medical teams mistakenly dropped pork-filled MREs to Kurdish allies.
Because they completely failed to realize that Kurds, being predominantly Muslim, absolutely do not eat pork.
The American doctors were terrified the Kurds were going to shoot them over the insult. It highlights a dangerous lack of education regarding religious dietary laws within military supply chains.
Dropping pork to a Muslim allied force in a combat zone is just an astonishing level of logistical oversight. You really can't make that up.
You really can't. And the commission also heard from Monsignor Frontiero, who represented the Archdiocese for the military services.
What was his focus?
He testified about the unique, often misunderstood burden placed on Catholic service members. In the Catholic tradition, sacraments like confession, the Eucharist, and the anointing of the sick are not just symbolic gestures or nice things to have. They are strict doctrinal obligations.
Right, so a Catholic soldier can't just pray alone in their bunk to receive last rites. The theology absolutely requires an ordained priest, correct?
Precisely. Monsignor Frontiero argued that when Catholic sacramental needs are viewed by military command simply as optional preferences rather than non-negotiable obligations, soldiers' souls are put at risk.
If a Catholic chaplain is restricted from traveling to a forward operating base or a submarine due to administrative red tape, those service members are effectively denied the full practice of their faith.
And this tension over what constitutes a non-negotiable religious obligation surfaced heavily during the COVID-19 pandemic. Which brings us to Mike Berry's testimony.
The Marine Corps reservist.
Yes, he's a reservist and a constitutional attorney who requested a religious accommodation to the COVID vaccine mandate. His immediate chain of command enthusiastically endorsed his request, noting how valuable his experience was to the unit.
But the higher-ups denied it.
Denied it in what Berry called a rubber stamp process. Berry testified to a glaring double standard. While the military frequently and easily granted medical exemptions, religious exemptions were almost universally denied across the board.
And the fallout for him was severe. He was unceremoniously placed into an inactive status, instantly losing his family's military health care coverage.
Which was a massive crisis, because his adopted daughter requires significant medical care for a severe disability.
He fought his way back in, though. He actually referred to himself in the transcript as a nuclear cockroach that just wouldn't die.
Quite the visual.
Yeah. But his testimony underscored a feeling that his religious beliefs made him undesirable to the military brass.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, multiple witnesses argued that the military relies heavily on what they call spiritual fitness. General Carver, a former Army chief of chaplains, testified that spiritual readiness is just as critical to a fighting force as physical readiness. When religion is treated merely as an administrative nuisance, or when deeply held beliefs are viewed as a threat to compliance, the military risks alienating and losing its most dedicated and morally grounded personnel.
Let's bring this closer to home, because the Commission heard about legal battles over religious expression, not just in massive federal institutions, but right in our local communities and neighborhood churches.
Pastor Robert Jeffress gave a prime example of this friction between the pulpit and the public square.
He's from the First Baptist Church of Dallas, right?
Yes. Pastor Jeffress testified about hosting an annual Celebrate Freedom patriotic service back in 2020. The guest speakers were Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of HUD Ben Carson.
Okay.
Jeffress stated that neither he nor anyone else officially endorsed a political candidate during the service. The speakers simply shared their personal faith journeys. However, a complaint was filed by an outside group, and it triggered a massive 14-month IRS investigation into the church's tax-exempt status.
Wait, how does the IRS justify investigating a church service? What is the legal mechanism there?
It's based on the 1954 Johnson Amendment. This is a provision in the U.S. tax code that prohibits all 501c3 nonprofit organizations, which includes churches, from endorsing or opposing political candidates.
But the witnesses argued there's a massive double standard in how this amendment is actually applied in the real world.
Very much so.
Pastor Jeffress pointed out that on the exact same Sunday, he told his congregation to simply vote their biblical convictions without naming a candidate. Joe Biden was speaking at another Baptist church.
Right.
And at that church, the pastor openly encouraged members to vote for Biden while standing directly in front of a campaign banner. Jeffress's church got audited for 14 months. The other church received no IRS pushback whatsoever.
And the legal experts at the hearing analyzed this dynamic, claiming the Johnson Amendment is rarely enforced equally. Instead, they argued it functions as a sword of Damocles hanging over the heads of conservative pastors.
To keep them quiet.
Used primarily to intimidate them into self-censorship. The fear isn't just losing tax-exempt status, it's the threat of crippling legal fees required to fight the federal government. The witnesses argued the government has absolutely no business regulating or monitoring what is said inside the worship service of any church in America.
The fight for the public square isn't just about massive megachurches fighting the IRS, though. Sometimes it is about an average citizen standing their ground in a small town.
Like Phyllis Morris.
Exactly. The commission heard from Phyllis Morris, a resident of Sweetwater, Texas.
Her story is a phenomenal example of grassroots religious liberty advocacy. Phyllis simply wanted to place a nativity scene at the local county courthouse, noting that all the other Christmas displays in town were entirely secular.
And when she approached the county judge, she anticipated the standard pushback, citing the separation of church and state.
So how does a regular citizen actually fight back against a county judge citing federal legal standards?
By doing her homework. Phyllis actually dug into the legal precedents and realized that the old standard judges used for decades to block these displays, something called the Lemon Test, had recently been overturned.
The Lemon Test previously required any holiday display on government property to have a strictly secular purpose.
But since the Supreme Court tossed that out, she presented this new legal reality directly to the county commissioners.
Even with the law on her side, there was immediate pushback. A letter to the editor of the local paper demanded the religious display be removed.
But because Phyllis knew her First Amendment rights and stood her ground during a highly attended public meeting, the commissioners ultimately backed down and allowed the nativity scene to stay.
It is now a permanent part of the county's annual Christmas display.
So what does this all mean? We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. From Orthodox Jewish students demanding civil rights enforcement on elite college campuses, to faith-based charities fighting for the right to pray with the homeless while receiving state funds.
We've seen Hindu soldiers navigating bureaucratic mazes to wear their religious markings in uniform.
And local citizens successfully placing nativity scenes at the courthouse.
It means that the boundaries of the First Amendment are not static. They are constantly being tested, pushed, and redefined by individuals willing to endure the friction.
Whether you are a university student navigating a chaotic protest, a professional working in a highly regulated public sector, or just a community volunteer organizing a holiday display in your hometown, these high-level commission hearings are not abstract legal theories.
No, they aren't.
They are actively shaping the legal and cultural boundaries of what you are allowed to say, what you are allowed to wear, and exactly how you are allowed to practice your faith in public spaces across America today.
This raises an important question, though. A thread running through all these testimonies is the aggressive pursuit of legal victories, securing federal funding for charities, demanding government accommodations in the military, winning court injunctions against universities. But if the future of religious liberty relies entirely on the state's purse strings and the favorable rulings of federal judges, we have to ask, does depending on the government to protect, fund, and validate religious expression fundamentally alter the deeply personal and spiritual nature of faith itself?
That's a great point.
If a faith requires the state's permission or funding to thrive in the public square, what happens when the state simply changes its mind?
That is a heavy, thought-provoking place to leave it, and certainly something for all of you to mull over as we watch these cases continue to unfold in the courts.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.